Hey friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using Stacey Yacula's Frost Loving Friends for MFT. So I've stamped out my images on 2 panels with extreme black hybrid ink on some Spectrum Noir ultra smooth premium white cardstock, and I'll be coloring with my Copic markers. I'm going to color my bunny first, and for him I'm using E41, E42, E43, and E44. So I'm using my darkest shade, that E44, first to lay in some shadows, and I'm kind of doing tiny little strokes because it kind of matches the style of the illustration. And it also is just going to help the marker colors blend together nicely, and I won't have as much streakiness because there's not like a solid line that needs to be broken up. And then I'm going to start to blend that out with the E43, making sure to catch the edge of that E44 and get things nice and soft and just pull it into the center. I did have a bit of a leak problem with that E43, so I pulled off the other cap just to equalize the pressure, and now I'm moving on to my E42. I will let that spot that kind of blobbed a little bit just dry, and I will touch that up with my colorless blender in just a bit. So I'm kind of coloring around his face so that I can keep his muzzle light. That's the area that I wanted to have a little bit of a lighter section on. So I'm just working my way towards that now with the E41 and leaving like a little half circle all around that little area there. But I'm going to finish coloring in his hands and add a little color to his feet with that E41. And then I'm going to grab the E40 and I'm going to use that as the transition shade between the edge of his muzzle, the coloring that I've done, and the white area. And I'll also add a little shadow to his belly with that and a little color to the inside of his ears. And then I'm going to come in and quickly do a second layer on him. This is something that I love to do, especially with larger images and also dark colored images. It just really smooths out the blend, it increases that saturation, and I don't know, I just love the way that it looks. So never be afraid to go over your images a second time if that's going to help you out. If you feel like your coloring isn't nice and smooth, then that's definitely a step that you can try. Now that that leak on his foot is dry, I'm going to go in with my colorless blender and just push that ink back out of that area. I'll also clean up any ink that went out of the edges and move on to the next step. So that is my little penguin, and for him I'm going to use W00, W1, W3, and W5. Even though he's a teeny tiny image, I wanted him to have as much dimension on him as the bunny does. So I started with the W5 and laid it in my shadows, and then I blended that out with the W3. I'm going to finish the darker part of his body with that W1. And then I'll come in and add the W00 to add some shadings to the white part of his body, so his little face and belly. For his beak and feet, I'll use YR02 and YR04. Just added a little of the YR04 first and then blended out with the YR02. And I did add a little bit more of that YR04 just to increase that saturation. And then I'm moving on to YR00 and YR01 to color the inside of the bunny's ears and also the little pads of his feet. So I used the YR01 first and then just blended that out with a flicking motion with the YR00. While I had those colors out, I also used those for some of the stripes on the little penguin's hat brim. So I just did one and then skipped 2 all the way around so it would be consistent. And I put my shading down at the bottom edge and then blended up toward the top. And I'll also do the little pom-pom on the top of his hat. When it came time to do his scarf, I wanted that to match, but I only used the YR01 just because the area was much smaller and there wasn't room to squeeze both shades in. Then I'm moving on to the top part of his hat, and I'm using B00, B00, and B02. So I'm just doing the shading from the back of his head forward because the bunny would be casting a shadow there. And I did do a second layer there just to increase that saturation and smooth everything out. And then I'm also going to color in some of the stripes on his hat band. So I use the B02 and the B00 to do the one to the left of the peach colored one. I used the B02 on his scarf. And then for the third stripe, I wanted that to be white, but just have a tiny bit of shading, so I just used a little of the B00. For the bunny scarf, I went with B02, B04, and B06, so it's kind of just a little bit of a deeper tone than what I used on the penguin's hat. And that way it will match but still be a little bit distinct. And I thought it would be too complicated to try to color in all of the little checks, so I did one solid, made it look like one solid color with just the black threads going through it. So I used the B06 as my darkest, and then the B04 as the mid-tone, and then a little B02 in the center for the highlight. I also did the little thermos to match with the same exact shades. I'm going to put the darkest shade on the left-hand side and then a tiny bit on the right, and then keep a nice highlight on there to make it look rounded and shiny. And I did go over that just a few times to make sure I had it the color that I wanted. And then I used the B02 to give a little light shading to the mugs and blended that out with the B00 so that it would just look like a white mug but had that cold look to it since we're going to be out in the snow. I used C1 and C3 to color the lid of the thermos, and then I'm going on to E50 and E51 for the top of the stump that our bunny and penguin friend are sitting on. There wasn't much room to do any rings or anything like that, so I just kept the shadow close to their bodies and blended out to the edge with the lighter shade. And then I'm also going to use these shades to do the little snowshoes, and for those I decided to shade them on the left-hand side. So I used the E51 on the left, and then I'm going to blend on the right-hand side with the E50. So there's actually not too much blending there. But these colors are so light that you really don't have to work at it too much. I did go back and add a little extra darkness with that E51, and then I'm going to move on to the bottom of the tree stump, and for that I'm using E25, E27, and E29. So the E29 is what I'm using first, and I'm trying to put like a little shadow on the bottom edge, but I don't want the bark to look all exactly the same. I want it to look like some of it is kind of pushed in and then other parts are popping out. So I'm trying to pick every few stripes there to add a full stripe of the E29 and hopefully make that look like that's the part that's indented. And I also tried not to make it like every certain number because I wanted it to be a bit more random. Then I'm going to come in with the E27 and blend out the edge of the E29 on the bottom, and then also just pick, you know, a few of the other little stripes in the bark to color with that E27 as well. Again, I had a little bit of a leak. I've mentioned I just refilled my markers recently, so they're very juicy, and but it's no big deal. You know, anytime that your markers leak, just take off the other cap and don't panic. Usually there's a way to fix it, and yeah, I wouldn't panic unless it's over like a face and it's a really dark color and there's no way to cover it up. In most cases it can be fixed. So I'm just going to fill in the rest of the tree with the E25 and create some of those lighter areas that look a bit more pushed out where they would be catching the light. And then I decided to go back to my YR00 and YR01 and add some rosy cheeks. So I did like a small oval shape with the YR01 and then kind of drew a circle around that with the YR00 to soften the edge. So that finishes up my images, and I'm going to move on to my background panel. First thing I'm going to do is take my B00 and B00 and outline the snow. So I'm using that B00 first and then blending that out with the B00 and letting that fade into the white. And that's just going to create like a frosty edge at the top of the snow and give it just a little bit more of a glow so it's not just plain white. Then I'm going to tuck an extra piece of paper behind the panel because I want to color in my sky. I'm using YR000, YR00, YR01, and YR02. And I showed you those first like that because there wasn't space to set them down on the panel while I color it. So I'm starting with the YR02 and I'm going to create like a little sunset scene here, or it could be sunrise, whatever you want. So I'm just adding like a dark bit down at the horizon line, and then I'm going to do some sweeping motions to kind of create the look of some clouds. And then I'm coming in with the YR01 and just continuing that. Sometimes I'm going over the edge of the YR02 to soften that up, and then I'll also add a few lines on its own. Then I'll use the YR00 and I'm going to continue doing the same, trying to avoid those trees, but they will be a darker shade, so if a little bit gets on them, it's not that big of a deal. But I'm just continuing to color in that sky. I'm trying to keep it a little bit darker at the bottom edge and then softer as it goes toward the top. So now I've got my YR000, which is my lightest shade, and I'm going to fill in the rest of that space. And then I will assess it from there and see what else I still want to add. Just making sure that everything looks fairly smooth, but like I said, I do want a bit of streakiness because that's the look that I'm going for. Kind of like some really wispy clouds that are tinged to this peachy tone, you know, just because of the time of day. So, like I said, I'm just going to work my way back and forth, add a bit more darkness where I think it needs it. Blend out the edges of the strokes with the lighter shades as necessary. And you'll notice that I'm holding my markers fairly far back on the barrel. I'm also keeping my hold on them nice and loose, and that is going to help me get those nice long strokes. For the trees, I wanted to keep to the color palette that I had been using. I didn't really want to introduce some green on there, so I decided to go with these blue greens, BG72, BG75, and BG78, so they'll kind of look like blue spruce trees. And I'm going to keep my shading on the right hand side, just because that's kind of where I'm imagining that the sun is kind of setting over to the left, so the right side is going to be in a bit more shade. Just based on how the sky turned out, it seems to be a little bit lighter in the left top corner than the right. So I just blended that out towards the middle with the BG75, and then I'll fill in the left-hand side with the BG72 as my highlight. And I wanted to create just a bit more contrast on those trees and give them like some sections of the boughs. So I went back with my BG78 and drew those in, and that is going to finish my background panel. So I trimmed down the background with one of the A2 Stitch Rectangle Stacks Set 2, and I also used the die that's included with the coordinating die set to cut out that little snowbank down at the center of the card. And now I'm going to stamp my sentiment at the bottom of the panel using Lawn Fawn Fish Tank ink. And I did the one that says, "Sending warm birthday wishes your way." Then I will pop my card base in my MISTI. I'm using MFT's Coral Crush cardstock, which I believe is no longer available, but it's very similar to Lawn Fawn Fake Tan. And I'm stamping on the inside with pumpkin spice ink. And I did the little bear and the sentiment that says, "Friendship makes even the coldest days warmer." For my pattern papers, I'm using the Party Plaid 6x6 from MFT, and I'm going to flip through until I find a pattern that is going to match the coloring that I've done. I kind of like flipped through before I started to make sure that there would be one that would match the color palette that I chose. I have trimmed that down with another of the A2 Stitch Rectangle Stacks Set 2. And this one gives you just the tiniest bit of a border on the outside edge for your cardstock to show through. So I'm lining that up on my card front. I was still out of liquid glue at this point, so I had to use my tape runner. And then I'm going to take these little snowshoes and insert those into the cut edge of the middle snowbank. So I just added a bit of adhesive to the back of those and then got them placed where I wanted them. And now that those are inserted, I'm going to cover the back with some foam tape so it gives it a bit of lift on the card, adds a little bit of dimension. So I'm peeling off those release papers, and then I will center that on my card front. And once I'm sure that it's straight, I will press that down into place. Then I can grab the rest of my images, which is just basically this big one and then also the little thermos. I'm going to add some adhesive to the back of that and get that situated above that sentiment so that it really looks like it's, you know, front and center. And then I'll have that thermos kind of tucked behind the root of the tree. You can't have a frosty scene without a little bit of glitter, so I'm going to take some Stardust Stickles and add a bit to the top of these little weeds that are poking out of the snow that kind of look like dandelions that have gone to seed. I'll also add some to their scarves and the inside of the bunny's ears. And I decided that I wanted some on the trees in the background as well, just to make them look like they have like some frozen branches there. So I just went over the shading detail and added a bit of sparkle there so it draws your eye further back in the scene. And that is going to complete my card for today. I'll lift that up so you can see how that catches the light, and I'll give you another peek at the inside. I just love these images so much. I think they're so cute. So if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. I post new ones every Monday and Friday. If you're interested in any of the products that I used today, you'll find those listed and linked in the description bar below. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos that I thought you might also enjoy. You can click on either one to check them out. I hope you all have an absolutely amazing day. Bye-bye.